The telemetry charts didn't register a heartbeat surge because Elena Vance wasn't trying to outrun the mountain. She stood on the observation deck of the Alabaster Watchtower, boots locked against the maglock grid, watching High Overseer Zyla's translucent skin flash amber as he processed the environmental readout. The Valari hegemony had spent 4 centuries certifying armor thickness. Elena had arrived with a ceramic pipe. "Your candidate displays remarkable calmness," logician Krell said, his secondary sensory node twitching. "The baseline human physiological markers suggest either neural sedation or profound ignorance." "Elena Vance," Zyla said, not looking away from the thermal map of Sector 4G, subsurface infrastructure analyst. "Frontier Outpost 9, no augmentation, no kinetic shielding, no redundant filtration systems." He paused. "She requested hand tools only. The obsidian shingle didn't care what you requested." Below, the basin stretched for 30 kilometers, a jagged sea of black glass needles and high electromagnetic interference. The casualty profile was absolute, 97.4% structural termination within the first 24 rotational hours. No species lacking triple redundant internal plating had ever survived past hour 14. The Valari Directorate had been very thorough in their documentation. They kept it in a ledger that needed more pages every season. Elena descended the transport ramp in her salt-stained slate-gray overalls. The quartz dust caught the light like scattered teeth. She didn't run. She didn't sprint toward the observation markers or the marked shelter zones. Instead, she unclipped the fractured ceramic fluid siphon from her belt, a heavy, notched white cylinder wrapped in vulcanized rubber grip tape, and inserted its tip into a hairline fissure in the exposed bedrock. She closed her eyes. She listened. "What is she doing?" Technician John's mandibles twitched. "The environmental pressure is already spiking. Surface temperature at 47 degrees Celsius and climbing." Elena drew the siphon back out. She made a notation on her diagnostic slate. Then she rotated 90 degrees on her heel and began walking in a direction that had no marked trail. "She's moving toward the unmapped sector," drone pilot Vex said. "The monolith is in that vector, trial marker 9. It isn't part of the course." Zyla's crystalline lattice flashed a deeper orange. "She doesn't have authorization to leave the designated field." "The field designation is self-imposed," Krell observed. "The trial parameters specify survival of the obsidian shingle. They do not specify method." Elena walked for 43 minutes. The thermometer on her wrist ticked upward, 51, 52, 53 Celsius. The wind began to shift, carrying with it the mineral bite of iron-filtered light. She could feel the pressure drop in the cartilage of her inner ear. Weather was moving in. Big weather. She reached the basalt monolith. It rose from the desert floor like a broken tooth, black and pocked with stress fractures that caught the light in thin, sharp lines. Elena circled the base slowly, laser-leveling pen in hand, tracing the seams where the stone's density shifted. There, and here, a weakness where the thermal stresses of 1,000 years of heat and cool cycles had fractured the molecular bond just enough. She found a seam 6 meters up the monolith's east face. She began to carve. The ceramic siphon's vibration edge worked against the basalt like a scalpel, not cutting, reading. Elena's hands moved with the rhythm of someone who had spent 8 years mapping the microscopic fractures in industrial foundation plates. This wasn't concrete and rebar. It was older, harder, and infinitely more honest about where it was broken. "Overseer," Technician John called out. His antennae were fully extended now. "Atmospheric pressure has dropped 23 points. We're reading a Category 9 thermal event forming on the southern horizon. The micro-sandstorm is consolidating." Eta to her position, 17 minutes. Zyla stepped closer to the environmental control panel. His hand hovered over the manual override switch, the one that accelerated lethality indices, the one that had ended 412 evaluations in just the manner the Directorate preferred: quick, documented, undeniable. He flipped the switch. The Category 9 became a Category 10. The pressure differential spiked. The electromagnetic interference spiked. The sand in the basin began to move in ways that sand should not move. She won't have time to reach the marked shelter zones, drone pilot Vex said. Not from that distance. Elena carved deeper into the monolith's face. Her breath came steady, her hands didn't shake. The ceramic siphon's tip grew hot from friction, but the stone was yielding. She was opening a pocket deep enough, a pocket with a seal that the desert couldn't collapse. The sky turned from pale yellow to copper to the color of old blood. Then it turned to static. The seam was deep enough. Elena sealed the opening with a folded section of her overalls pressed into place, then wedged the ceramic siphon into a secondary crack to hold the fabric tight. It wouldn't stop all the sand. It would stop enough. The temperature inside the carved pocket would stabilize. The pressure wouldn't kill her. She had 30 seconds to verify the seal before the full force of the storm arrived. She had 31 seconds of warning because she was listening to the wind. In the observation tower, Zyla watched the thermal array collapse into static. His crystalline skin flashed orange, then red. The Category 10 was consolidating faster than the models predicted. The micro-sandstorm was now a kinetic wall, a 3-kilometer-high barrier of razor-sharp quartz moving at velocities that would shear the hull, plating off a military-grade transport. It would hit the monolith in seconds. Casualty confirmation protocol, Technician Jan asked quietly. Stand ready, Zyla said. The storm struck. Outside the monolith, the world became a howling vortex of molten glass and lightning strikes that liquefied the surrounding desert into sheets of burning amber. The academic observation outposts, the expensive ones, the ones that had measured 412 prior executions, began to fail in cascading sequence. Their sensor arrays shattered. Their communication arrays died. Their structural reinforcements, built from the same kinetic-resistant material as the Valari's own armor, began to unravel because the sand knew exactly where the welds were weak. The monolith stood, not because it was stronger, because Elena had carved it to breathe. The aerodynamic pocket she had cut into its eastern face caused the storm's velocity to shear off at an angle. The wind that should have demolished the structure instead split around it, creating a pressure differential that pulled the storm's core away from the stone. The Category 10 became a spiraling vortex that missed its target and instead concentrated its full destructive force on the observation equipment surrounding the basin. High Overseer Zyla felt the first moment of absolute incomprehension as his primary monitoring array went dark, then his secondary array, then his backup telemetry. Everything he had positioned to certify a human casualty was being systematically erased from existence. System status, his voice came out flat, clinical. Observation platforms 9 through 14 are non-responsive, drone pilot Vex said. Platforms 1 through 8 registering cascading structural failures. Platform 12 is, Vex paused. Platform 12 just tore off its foundation. Krell's sensory node had stopped twitching. It hung limp, dormant, a sign of absolute cognitive shutdown. The human, Zyla said. Where is the human? Vex's antennae drooped. The only active sensor is the portable unit on the recovery drone. It's reading. He didn't finish the sentence. Read it. Biosignature stable, heart rate 52, breathing shallow and rhythmic, no injury markers, temperature control within normal parameters. Vex's mandibles twitched once. She's resting, Overseer, inside the monolith. While your storm destroys your own infrastructure, she is resting. Inside the carved pocket, Elena Vance sat in absolute darkness, her hands folded across her knees. The white ceramic siphon glowed faintly with kinetic friction, casting a thin red line across the salt-stained fabric of her overalls. The monolith's interior had stabilized at 42 degrees Celsius. The carved seam was holding pressure. Her laser-leveling pen clicked twice as she noted the time on her diagnostic slate. The storm would pass in approximately 1 hour and 17 minutes. She had enough water for 3 hours, enough oxygen for 5. She waited. Outside, something moved in the chaos. The diamond-edged crystal worms, drawn by the monolith's vibrations, had converged on the structure's base. They were massive, each segment longer than Elena was tall, their bodies half buried in the liquefying sand, their sensory nodes tracking the source of the acoustic pattern that had drawn them. These were Aridus Prime's apex predators. They had evolved to hunt anything that made a sound in the desert. The monolith's carved seam was broadcasting a harmonic frequency that looked like an easy kill. One worm dove toward the seam. Elena, listening to the vibration pattern through the stone beneath her palms, understood in an instant what was approaching. She rose from her seated position without haste. She drew the ceramic siphon from her belt. Then, with the precision of someone who had spent 8 years mapping stress fractures, she struck the monolith's interior wall at a specific point, not harder, just different. A frequency shift. The worms felt the change. The acoustic signature had inverted. The harmonic was no longer prey. It was a territorial marker from something vastly larger, something older than they were. The apex predators did not challenge that. They burrowed backward into the deep shale, their sensory nodes retracted, their hunt abandoned. Elena waited another 40 minutes. The storm began to weaken. The velocity drops. The pressure differentials equalized. The sky shifted from burning amber back to pale yellow. Then the wind simply died, leaving behind a landscape of new obsidian glass sculptures where the desert used to be. High Overseer Xyler stood motionless in the alabaster watchtower. His crystalline skin had stopped flashing. It had gone a shade of pale, broken blue, a color that no Valari linguist had ever successfully named, because Valari physiology simply did not produce that emotional state. Shame, fear, obsolescence. "She's moving," drone pilot Vex said. His voice carried the flat precision of someone reporting data they did not understand. "She's emerging from the monolith." Elena Vance stepped out into the scorched basin, her slate-gray overalls dusted white with silica, but completely unrent. She paused at the monolith's base. She collected 3 rare crystallized quartz specimens from the desert floor, where the heat had fused new geometric patterns into the stone. She dropped them into her utility pocket. Then she turned back toward the observation tower. She began walking toward the recovery transport with the same rhythmic gait she had used to cross the desert. Measured, unhurried. A person crossing a room in their own home, not a person who had just survived the extinction event that had destroyed 300 empires before her. Xyler's hand moved toward the environmental control panel. For just an instant, his fingers hovered over the master reset. One final override, one final storm, one final human casualty entered into the ledger. Krell's secondary sensory node reactivated. "Overseer," the logician said quietly, "if you execute the override protocol now, every remaining species in the evaluation queue will know. They will see the ledger correction. They will understand that the Directorate requires 200 years of preparation to certify a single human female. They will leave." Xyler's hand fell away from the panel. "Prepare the debriefing chamber," he said. "Elena Vance has earned the right to make a request." "I wish I could tell you it ended there. It didn't." She walked into that debriefing chamber and asked to see what they called the deep volcanic sector. The volcanic sector wasn't a test. It was a threat assessment. Elena stood in the briefing chamber as logician Krell displayed the thermal maps across 3 panoramic screens. The deep lava fields of Aridus Prime, a region where subsurface magma chambers had begun to rupture through the crust in fractal patterns. The temperature at the designated trial zone hit 127 degrees Celsius at ground level. Deeper down, where the actual evaluation would take place, the readings became theoretical. The instruments stopped functioning at around 200 degrees. "No species has ever completed an evaluation in this sector," Krell said flatly. His sensory node remained still. "Clinical. We have documented exactly 3 attempts. All 3 resulted in immediate cellular degradation." "What did they bring?" Elena asked. "Full environmental containment suits, kinetic temperature diffusers, emergency thermal dispersal drones." Krell paused. "They brought everything." Elena nodded. She had already noted what she wasn't seeing in the thermal data, the electromagnetic interference patterns that had shaped the obsidian shingle. This time, the reading seemed clean, almost honest. "I'll need different tools," she said. I need to see your subsurface mapping data, the geological surveys, the mineral composition breakdowns. I need to understand how the magma is moving, not how much heat it generates. High Overseer Xyler watched from the observation gallery above the briefing chamber. His crystalline skin had begun to stabilize back to its base amber, but there was a fracture running through his upper left side now, a stress fracture in the lattice, where the Category 10's destruction had hit close enough to crack him. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone. She's asking for geological data, Krell's voice came through the comm. Not protective gear, not augmentation, geological data. Give her everything, Xyler said. She's earned the right to make an informed decision. The decision came in 3 hours. Elena would enter the deep lava fields alone. She would bring the geological surveys, her laser leveling pen, her ceramic siphon, and one item the Directorate had never seen a human candidate request, a length of copper wire, 3 millimeters in diameter, wrapped around a simple wooden spool. She would descend to the lowest accessible depth, where the magma pressure readings remained stable. She would spend exactly 2 hours in the designated trial zone. No rescue protocol, no monitoring, no fallback. This is suicide, Technician John said. His antennae were fully extended, a sign of acute distress. She has reviewed the data. She understands the lethality indices. She knows that no cooling mechanism will function at those temperatures. She understands something we don't, Krell replied quietly. I suspect she always has. The volcanic sector's observation post was smaller than the obsidian shingles tower and positioned much lower. It had to be, given the thermal radiation. Elena could feel the heat beginning as soon as she descended the first 100 meters. The air itself became thick, viscous, almost liquid. Her lungs adapted quickly enough. Her skin flushed. Her sweat glands went into overdrive. At 150 meters depth, she found the first of her markers. The geological surveys had shown her exactly where the magma chambers were creating pressure vents, tiny fissures where superheated air was being forced upward through fractured rock. Elena had mapped them. She had calculated their spacing, their temperature gradients, their flow patterns. She wrapped the copper wire around the largest vent, spiraling it in a precise pattern. The wire began to glow as it conducted the heat. As the copper heated, it began to release its own infrared signature, a diffuse, manageable thermal bloom that changed the surrounding air pressure just enough. Then she sat in the space she had just created and began to breathe through her mouth instead of her nose, reducing the direct thermal contact with her mucous membranes. She had read once, in a paper on subsurface mining operations, that the human body's survival threshold wasn't determined by what temperature the external environment reached. It was determined by what temperature the body was allowed to maintain. She had brought a thermometer. She had brought calculations. She had brought the understanding that a mountain, magma, or quartz or basalt was not trying to kill her. It was simply being itself. The only question was whether she could position herself inside that self. 2 hours passed. In the observation post, drone pilot Vex watched the portable temperature sensor she was carrying. It should have flatlined. It should have registered a casualty. Instead, it was dropping slightly as Elena approached the 2-hour mark. Her core temperature had stabilized at 38.9 degrees Celsius. She's intentionally cooling herself, Vex said. The copper wire is functioning as a heat sink. She's sitting in the middle of a thermal vent field and using conductive metal to create a microclimate. Xyler felt something shift in his consciousness. A fracture, not in his crystalline lattice this time, but in something deeper, a structural belief about how the universe worked, how survival worked, how power worked. The humans didn't bring armor to fight the desert. They didn't bring shields to battle the volcano. They brought mathematics. They brought observation. They brought an absolute, methodical refusal to meet force with force and instead carved out a space inside the force itself. Elena emerged from the deep lava fields exactly on schedule. Her overalls were scorched black on the edges, but the fabric underneath remained intact. She was carrying the copper wire spool in one hand and 3 irregular basalt cores in the other, samples she had extracted using the siphon's vibration edge, proof that she had reached the designated depth. She had also brought something else, a small vial filled with minerals that had crystallized inside the pressure vents where the magma and the cooler rock layers met, formations that should not have existed, proof that she had found the exact boundary where two incompatible environments were forced into an equilibrium. Xyla descended from the observation post and met her at the sector's entry point. For a moment, he simply stood there, his massive frame casting a shadow across Elena's Sultandash-stained figure. The Directorate has been running the deep lava fields evaluation for 117 years, he said quietly. We have lost 12 researchers in that time trying to understand why the sector functions as it does. We have spent enormous resources building protective systems that fail. He looked down at the copper wire spool in Elena's hand. You brought wire and mathematics, he said. You brought observation and positioning. You brought absolutely nothing that looks like power in the way we understand power. Elena met his gaze steadily. Your defensive systems all assume the environment is an enemy that has to be defeated. I just assumed it was a system I had to understand. There's a difference. There is, Xyla said. His crystalline skin had begun to flash orange again, but this time it wasn't anger or embarrassment. It was something that didn't have a name in the Valari lexicon. The deep lava fields evaluation is now concluded. You have earned full acknowledgement of your species' competency profile. He paused. But there's one more sector, the basalt trench, the one we built specifically to ensure that no species, no matter how adaptive, could survive. His voice dropped lower. That one kills on principle. That one kills because we designed it to kill, because we needed to know that there was still something in the universe that a human could not outthink. Elena listened to that without flinching. Then I should see it, she said. The basalt trench wasn't a sector, it was a confession. Elena descended the final access shaft as the observation team locked down all external monitoring. The trench was sealed from the surface. No drones could follow, no telemetry could track, no rescue was possible. The Directorate had designed it that way on purpose. It needed to be a place where a species died absolutely, where the mechanism was so complete that no observer could pretend the death was anything other than a fundamental incompatibility with existence. The temperature at the deepest level hovered around 180 degrees Celsius. The pressure was so densely concentrated that the air itself had begun to behave like liquid, but those were the minor features. The major feature was the structure. The basalt trench was built as a series of progressively narrowing chambers, each one designed to funnel movement downward and inward with no horizontal escape route. The walls were not smooth. They were fractured in a pattern that mimicked the joint stress points of every major species the Directorate had ever tested. The fractures were precisely angled to catch claws, to snag chitinous plates, to trap limbs that were too rigid or too articulated. It was a space designed to kill through architecture, to take the very structural integrity that kept a species alive and turn it into a cage. Elena stood in the entrance chamber, her ceramic siphon in one hand and her laser-leveling pen in the other. She had reviewed the geological surveys one final time. She understood now why 3 researchers had died trying to map this place. The trench wasn't just a test. It was a monument to the Directorate's certainty that force, structure, and material rigidity were the only languages the universe understood. She began to descend. The first chamber narrowed as she moved deeper. The fractured walls pressed inward. Elena did not fight the narrowing. She turned sideways and slipped through the spaces between the fractures like water finding a crack. Her salt-stained overalls caught and tore on the sharp basalt edges, but she did not stop. She moved with the rhythm of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the language of rock, finding the weaknesses, the gaps, the places where rigidity created openings instead of barriers. The second chamber was hotter. The pressure was so intense that her ears began to ring. Elena paused, pulled a small medical foam plug from her utility pocket, and inserted it into each ear canal. The ringing stopped. She had brought the foam because she had read that some deep-sea mining operations used it to equalize pressure differentials. Most people would have brought armor. Elena had brought information. The third chamber was where the mechanism revealed itself. The walls were not stationary. They were slowly contracting, closing the chamber down on a cycle that took approximately 3 hours. The trench was designed to compress anything inside it into a progressively smaller space until structural failure became inevitable. For a rigid species, anything with exoskeletons or crystalline lattices, the compression would eventually exceed their load-bearing capacity. Their shells would crack, their joints would shatter. They would die not from heat or pressure alone, but from the mathematics of force meeting immovable architecture. Elena sat down in the center of the chamber. She placed her laser-leveling pen on the floor in front of her and adjusted the beam so it struck the contracting wall directly. Then she waited. As the walls moved inward, the laser beam struck each new surface at a slightly different angle. The beam's path changed. Elena watched the pattern with absolute focus, measuring the rate of compression against the geometry of the space. The walls were moving inward at approximately 2.3 centimeters per minute. They would reach her current position in approximately 131 minutes. She stood up and moved backward, deeper into the trench, positioning herself exactly where the compression rate suggested she should be, not running ahead of the collapsing walls, not trying to fight them, but instead calculating where the safe zone would exist as the geometry changed. For the next 2 hours and 9 minutes, Elena Vance moved through the basalt trench as if she were dancing with an opponent who followed mathematical rules. Each time the walls contracted, she repositioned herself. Each time the pressure increased, she redistributed her weight differently. She was not surviving the trench. She was participating in it. Zyla watched from the sealed observation chamber at the trench's rim. The portable sensor on Elena's wrist transmitted her vital signs directly to his primary display. Heart rate, 61 beats per minute. Breathing, slow and rhythmic. Core temperature, 39.2 degrees Celsius. She was not panicking, she was not suffering. She was simply existing inside a space that should have been lethal, treating it with the same methodical pragmatism she had applied to the desert and the volcano. "She isn't fighting it," Krell said quietly. His sensory node was fully extended now, processing information at maximum capacity. "She's moving with it, like she knows exactly what the trench wants to do, and she's simply letting it do it around her." Zyla felt the fracture in his crystalline lattice expand slightly, a physical manifestation of something breaking inside him that had never broken before: certainty. The absolute conviction that the universe could be divided into the strong and the weak, the adapted and the doomed, the deserving and the expendable. Elena emerged from the basalt trench exactly as the final chamber reached its maximum compression. She stepped out of the access shaft into the observation chamber, her overalls now completely shredded, her skin marked with dozens of small cuts where the fractured basalt had caught her, but her eyes clear and her breathing still steady. She held up the ceramic siphon. It had been transformed by the heat and pressure. The white ceramic was now threaded with fine black lines of mineral deposition, a map of the thermal gradients it had experienced. The siphon had passed through all 3 sectors unchanged in function, but fundamentally altered in appearance, proof that it had been tested in the deepest crucible the Directorate could devise. "No one survived the Sandstorm," Elena said. Her voice was quiet, matter-of-fact, except the girl who learned to read how hard the mountain was breathing. High Overseer Zyla stood motionless. The fracture in his crystalline skin had stopped expanding. It had simply stopped, frozen at the exact moment he understood the truth, that everything the Directorate had built to measure strength was obsolete, that the future of the galaxy now belonged to a species that did not measure itself by armor or force or the rigidity of its exoskeleton, but by its capacity to understand the language of the world it inhabited and speak back to that world in its own terms. "The evaluation is concluded," he said finally. "Elena Vance, you have exceeded all established competency profiles. Your species is certified for unlimited resource extraction, territorial autonomy, and full voting participation in hegemonic governance." Elena nodded. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply reached down and retrieved a small cloth from her utility pocket and began, methodically, to clean the siphon. "There's one more thing," she said. She looked directly at Zyla, and there was something in her gaze that made even the High Overseer feel the weight of that attention. The electromagnetic nodes in the obsidian shingle, the ones that were artificially accelerating the storm patterns during my sector trial. I found the nodes while I was mapping the monolith. I counted 7 of them. She paused. You were trying to kill me, trying to make sure no human could pass, no matter what we brought to the table. And I survived anyway, not despite your sabotage, because I understood it well enough to use it. The observation chamber went absolutely silent. So here's what we're going to do, Elena continued. You're going to take me to the Valari hegemony's deep archive, the one where you keep the records of every species you've ever evaluated, every failure, every casualty, every extinction you've certified as necessary. She set the siphon down gently on the observation table, because your next evaluation isn't going to be human anymore. It's going to be your own institutional foundation. And I want to be there when you understand exactly how brittle it is. Xyla's crystalline skin flashed a pale, broken blue, the color of absolute obsolescence. In the gallery above, in the watching stations throughout the hegemony, in the quantum-locked communication matrices that connected 1,000 species to this single moment, the implications began to propagate. The Directorate, for the first time in 400 years, did not control the narrative. A human had not simply survived their ultimate test, she had weaponized it. She had turned the apparatus of institutional domination into a mirror, and now the Valari were forced to look at their own structural integrity with the same merciless clarity Elena had applied to stone and sand and fire. Elena picked up her siphon and walked toward the exit chamber. Her overalls hung in tatters. Her skin was marked with a dozen small wounds, but her gait was steady, rhythmic, the measured pace of someone walking through their own home. Behind her, High Overseer Xyla watched her go, and for the first time in his long existence, the master architect of trials understood what it meant to be the subject of an evaluation from which there was no escape. The ceramic siphon, now etched with the black lines of every sector it had survived, caught the light one final time as Elena climbed the access stairs toward the surface. A worn white cylinder wrapped in vulcanized tape, transformed by fire and pressure into something the Directorate had never anticipated encountering, proof that survival was not about resisting the world's attempts to destroy you. It was about becoming flexible enough to exist inside those attempts, to read them, to understand them, and to turn them into the very foundation of your own unshakable certainty. The gallery screens began to flicker as 1,000 species received the confirmation signal. No one had survived the sandstorm. No one had survived the deep lava fields. No one had survived the basalt trench. Except the girl who learned to read.